September 9th, 1918. The Russian Civil War. Britain was at war with Soviet Russia. Scottish troops had advanced far, but were still hundreds of miles from their objectives. A show of force by Royal Navy gunboats had prompted the Bolsheviks to pull back, for now. Britain needed to advance, but the makeshift Russian troop transport, Elma, was out of action. So if the Allies wanted to move forward, they'd have to do it on foot, through the cold, wet, mosquito-ridden Russian forest. B Company of the Royal Scots were to take on the arduous march forward. Before they went, 2 barges carrying reinforcements arrived, just in time. The troops aboard were fresh, but their ships bore curious battle scars, even though these vessels had never been near the official front line. Ambushes by Soviet partisans were becoming frequent, and drifting mines had been set loose in the river, which could blow a ship in half. The 200-kilometer voyage from the landing site at Arkangel to the front line at Bereznik was now becoming a battlefield of its own. The first barge carried anti-Bolshevik Russian volunteers. The second ship carried a more unusual force, a company of the Slavo-British Allied Legion. Russian toughness amplified by British doctrine and officers. It worked. These men were perhaps the highest-grade troops on the northern Russian battlefield. 2 platoons each of White Russians and Slavo-British legionnaires were assigned to support the Scots on their journey. They'd march through the forest with Opit, a Russian gunboat, sailing beside them, ready to blast any Bolsheviks who got in the way. Further upriver, a few hours later, the daring vessel from the days before, Advocat, was steaming ahead to cover the flank of the Allied Varga column. What they found sent them rushing back at full speed. A large Bolshevik force had been uncovered, which was on the march toward Bereznik. The Soviet Russians weren't attacking the town directly. They were playing it smart. Their plan? Occupy the village of Osinovo on the north bank and choke off river traffic. It would be a checkmate, stranding the Scottish-Russian column who were already on the march and by this time some distance beyond the junction. It couldn't be allowed. Fortunately for the Allied force, ample reinforcements were expected the following day. At dawn, new barges arrived at Bereznik, A and C companies of the Royal Scots. They were ordered to disembark on the northern bank, wet, cold, and ankle-deep in mud. Without docks, the soldiers had to walk gangplanks into the mud before trudging into waist-deep water to push the vessels away, who had beached themselves on the shallow riverbank to get the Scots ashore. Then came Tolstoy, an ancient steamship propelled by paddled side wheels. It looked as if it was straight out of the American Civil War. She carried field guns, troops, and supplies, all of which had to be offloaded via tiny wooden paddle boats. Moving a howitzer this way was an act of madness, but there was no alternative. The troops aboard Tolstoy were from an extraordinarily remarkable background, a platoon of Poles. No one in Bereznik knew exactly how they'd ended up in Arctic Russia. After all, the World War was yet to reach its conclusion, and Poland was still tightly under German occupation. But the origin of the Poles didn't matter. They proved eager and capable troops. At night, B Company of the Royal Scots reached Ust-Varga. If they abandoned it, they risked the Soviets reoccupying the village and encircling them. So the Scots, already exhausted by the long march, stayed to hold the line. The Slavo-British legionaries moved on alone. The following morning, A and C Company of the Royal Scots were waiting in fortified posts around Osinovo. Trenches were completely impossible in the riverside mud. They flooded virtually instantly. So bunkers were constructed from felled trees, known as blockhouses. Then, as the sun set on the 11th of September, the first Soviet troops arrived. Though unclear, it's likely that the Soviets spotted British positions sometime before engaging. As the sun set, they were likely hurrying to form a battle line. They had expected to take the village on the march, and there was absolutely no time to waste if they were to stick to their timetable. They would attack head-on, relying on shock. tracer belts from Russian machine guns suddenly parted the evening twilight, providing cover for a Soviet column to race up the main road into the settlement. Suddenly, the fate of the British who had entered northern Russia so confidently became uncertain. The Soviets and British were a roughly equal force on paper, with the British being the slightly larger of the two. The British had hoped that the Soviets would call off their offensive with the fall of night. But the Soviet heavy guns flung illumination rounds, and it became clear that they could only be warded off in a storm of steel. Through heavy fighting, Soviet riflemen gradually pushed their way forward, adopting stormtrooper tactics which had been used against them by the Germans. The Scots were undergoing a brutal trial by fire. They had never fought a battle before, but were holding their own thanks to being well drilled by the small number of Irish war veterans amongst their ranks. The night was fought to a desperate push and pull, with advances measured in meters. But the Soviets were about to meet the strongest arm of British military power, the Royal Navy. The Battle of Osinovo was done. It had been a decisive British victory. Royal Navy monitor ships M25 and M23 had arrived in the dead of night and had coincidentally come just in time to save the Scottish troops. With their heavy guns, the tide of battle on the Dvina turned heavily in favor of the Allies. Upon realizing that they were facing such formidable ships, it's likely that the Soviets pulled back a great distance, had they not already. The next morning, the shaken and bruised Scots were ordered to immediately push forward of their defenses. British command sensed the initiative. Even the staggering losses of the World War had not shaken them of that keen pursuit of breakthrough which had driven them to commit hopeless cavalry attacks in the Battle of the Somme. Advancing along the Dvina River's northern bank was a miserable affair. The ground was composed of cold, wet mud, which boots sank into and which made marching exhausting. It was all beneath a veil of tall, unkempt grass, which made calculating your next footfall near impossible. Every now and then a Scotsman would lose his footing and plunge into near-freezing water, which would further chill in the Arctic wind. By the evening of the 12th, they entered the village of Prelutski. There was no sign of the enemy. General Poole was now fully keen to the sense that he was onto a breakthrough. And so, he drew plans to have the Varga column abandon their mission on the Varga River and make for the Dvina to reinforce A&C companies of the Royal Scots. By the evening of the 13th, the Scots had repeated the previous day's success and completely foiled the old Soviet plan. They were now in Kobalski, over 20 kilometers from Bereznik, and roughly 10 kilometers from the river junction, putting it well out of a range of Soviet guns. Their success had put them in quite a vulnerable position. The so-called Dvina-Varga Triangle, the wedge of forested land between the rivers, was still occupied to some degree by Bolshevik partisans, and the Royal Scots had no presence on the southern bank of the River Dvina. It was time. As the sun set on the 13th of September, orders came down the telegraph cable from Arkangel to Bereznik that the Varga column was to be diverted. Their new mission was to secure the southern bank of the Dvina. In practice, only B Company of the Royal Scots would be sent. They were still in Ust-Varga. The Slavo-British vanguard of the column had by now advanced too far to be contacted. On the morning of the 14th, Tolstoy carried the order: along with a detachment of Slavo-British troops who had maps to guide the column to their new objective. The Scots were ferried across to the desolate right bank of the river as the sun rose at 5 a.m. The terrain ahead was brutal, making the previous day's advance of A and C companies look like a walk in a park. The route was known to local Russians as a winter road. In other words, only passable when the ground froze. But in September, it was a death trap of sucking mud, swarming mosquitoes, and sheer exhaustion, which local Russians were too sensible to venture into. This seemed to be a nuance lost to British command, who by the timetable of their plan evidently expected the Scots to reach the village of Chamovo within 3 hours after a brisk forced march, a task which was possible for marching troops under normal conditions. But through the quagmire which lay ahead, it was utter madness. A single platoon of the Scots were assigned the relatively fortunate task of splitting from B Company and advancing south to the distant village of Mala Bereznik in search of the Slavo-British forces who had gone off the radar and seemingly disappeared. The banks of the Varga were steeper and less swampy than those of the Dvina, so this detachment of B Company would have an easier time. Nonetheless, they were marching into the unknown. 3 hours later, HMS M25, Advocat, and the newly arrived armoured yacht Razliff dutifully steamed toward Chamovo, expecting to support the Scots. It was predictably apparent that the Scots of B Company were nowhere to be found, and the village's surroundings were occupied by Bolsheviks. Moguchi, a Soviet gunboat, was caught by surprise and disabled near instantly, with its engines and boiler exploding under fire from M25. A field gun opened fire on the Royal Navy ships from the woods. It was silenced by M25's quick reaction. In the lull, the Royal Navy rescued the wounded enemy crew from the water, even press-ganging Moguchi's navigator into Allied service. M25 then pulled alongside the sinking ship to rescue a further 10 who were too injured to move. The bank was quiet and minutes went by. Still no sign of the Scots. The Scots were only halfway through their journey. They had given an admirable effort, but the column had stopped completely. Several men had nearly drowned in the swamp ahead. Slavo-British pioneers were busy at work, felling trees and constructing log walkways to get the troops across the morass. And in the meantime, the troops were going mad, floundering in the thick mud while under attack from all sides by mosquitoes. The Royal Navy ships were growing restless. They were extremely vulnerable to close enemy fire from the shore, and the objective seemed to lay open for the taking. So they took matters into their own hands. A party of 33 sailors from the yachts Razliff and Advocat formed an ad hoc naval infantry platoon. They moved into Chamovo and straight into a well-planned Bolshevik ambush. 3 were killed instantly, and more were shot as they retreated in disorder. As the sailors fled, their fear was realized, and a hidden howitzer began shelling their ships as well as M25. The mission was quickly turning into a disaster, and the sailors had to flee. They hurried back aboard the ships, taking further losses to enemy fire, and in fury unleashed a full naval barrage on Chamovo, practically flattening the village as they left. Then came the chase. The whole Soviet flotilla was made aware of the commotion and emerged to pursue the British. All the while, Soviet infantry emerged on either bank, firing on the British ships with all they had. Only the arrival of M23, who had heard the commotion, saved the flotilla from disaster. As quickly as they appeared, the Soviet flotilla pulled back. But they weren't finished. They were preparing to fight another day. When the Scots finally arrived at Chamovo that evening, the Soviets had vanished. All that remained were about 40 bodies, some lying in the streets, others in the forest. Both civilian and soldier were among the casualties. The night of the 14th of September passed. With it, the war on the Dvina-Varga junction became a week old. But it was only beginning. By the evening of September 15th, the Allied order of battle looked chaotic. At Ust-Varga, a single Russian platoon still held out, maintaining sporadic contact with Bereznik HQ. The rest? Gone. The two Slavo-British platoons had vanished down the Varga, swallowed by the forest without a word. And the lone Scottish platoon that had followed them, silent. No one knew where they were, or if they were alive. On the Dvina, the Royal Scots had dug in. A and C companies clung to the northern bank. B Company, now stranded in Chamovo with their backs to a trackless forest on the southern shore, they had no direct support. As for D Company, they were over 200 kilometers away in Arkangel, stuck performing civil police duties. Duties that, by all rights, were meant for the Americans. The Americans had been sent to Russia only on the understanding that they would never see the battlefield. But British General Poole had sent them south. They were currently organizing in Bereznik, and in the face of stiff Soviet action, it was time for Poole to finally violate the British pledge to the American president. The Americans were to see some of the fiercest combat of the war. B, C, and D companies were to move on the Dvina to assist the Scots in their heavy clashes. It was a daunting task. A Company believed itself momentarily spared, but orders subsequently came down that the British officer staff were coming to stay in the town and convert it into a headquarters. A Company was to advance alone on the Varga, into the silent wilderness that had already swallowed 4 platoons whole. It was a tremendous task for troops and officers who had never even seen combat. Not only this, but in the absence of any contactable British forces on the Varga, the unprecedented move would be made of giving the fresh and inexperienced American company command of the entire front. The 1st and 4th platoons of A Company would lead the trip. They got aboard Tolstoy, and American Captain Otto Odyard set about preparing his men for the arduous journey of the days to come.